Right, so welcome back for another deep dive, and this time we're going back to the 1930s Cleveland for a look at a case that is just as chilling as it is baffling, the Cleveland torso murders.
Ooh,
You've given us some really fascinating material to work with, excerpts from the Cleveland Police Museum's exhibit on the torso murderer.
that's a good word.
Get this, the killer actually taunted Eliot Ness, who was the safety director at the time,
Oh, wow.
by leaving victims within sight of his office.
Oh my gosh, that's so creepy.
Talk about creepy.
Yeah, it's incredible how a case this notorious can still hold so many unanswered questions,
Yeah.
The torso murderer was never caught, and the level of brutality involved is something that, well, it stays with you.
Yeah, for sure. So, okay, paint us a picture of Cleveland in the 1930s. Like, what was the scene like in Kingsbury Run where most of the victims were found?
So Kingsbury Run was known as the Roaring Third or or hobo jungle.
Okay.
So imagine like shanty towns, poverty, a transient population moving through. And it's not just a backdrop, it was almost like a hunting ground for this killer.
Oh, wow.
The transient nature of the people there made identification incredibly difficult and allowed the killer to kind of disappear back into the shadows.
That's chilling. And the way the victims were found, tell us about the killer's MO.
So this wasn't just murder. It was a spectacle, decapitation, dismemberment, some bodies even cut in half. And here's the thing, the cause of death was often the dismemberment itself, not something prior.
Wow.
Plus, some of the bodies were treated with a chemical that turned the skin red and tough and leathery.
Oh, my God.
And what's fascinating is that this points to a level of anatomical knowledge, potentially medical, which adds a whole other dimension to the mystery.
Hold on. Are we saying the killer might have been a doctor or something?
Right.
That's terrifying.
Yeah.
And to think they were never caught. Didn't they have any leads?
They had suspects, of course. Two names come up repeatedly, Frank Dolezal and Dr. Francis Sweeney. Dolezal had connections to some of the victims and died under suspicious circumstances in jail.
Oh, wow.
He was later exonerated, though some still believe his death was a cover-up.
Wow. So why? Was he truly involved, or did somebody want to silence him? That's a puzzle in itself.
Right.
And what about this Dr. Sweeney? What made him a suspect?
So Sweeney was a World War I veteran, possibly suffering from psychological trauma.
Okay.
He was known to be an alcoholic and failed multiple polygraph tests.
Right.
But here's where it gets really strange.
Oh,
He supposedly sent threatening postcards to Eliot Ness even while confined to an institution.
whoa. If he was confined, how was he sending postcards?
Right.
That doesn't add up with somebody helping him. This makes his potential involvement even more suspicious.
Right.
And you said these postcards stopped after Sweeney died. Makes you wonder if he really was the torso murderer.
Yeah, it's a tantalizing clue, isn't it?
Yeah.
But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Officially, there are 12 victims attributed to the torso murderer, but some believe the number could be much higher, maybe even 20 or more.
Wow.
Sadly, only 3 have been positively identified. Edward DeBassi, Florence Polio, and possibly Rose Wallace.
Wait, they're still trying to identify victims after all these years?
Yes, just this year, the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner teamed up with the DNA Doe Project to exhume some of the unidentified victims.
Wow.
They're using cutting-edge DNA tech and genealogical research to finally put names to these forgotten souls.
That's incredible. Imagine finally getting answers after all this time.
Yeah.
Each of those unidentified victims has a story, a life cut short. It's heartbreaking.
It is, and the museum exhibit does a great job of reminding us that these weren't just numbers, they were people.
Right.
They had families, friends, lives they were living, and for example, one exhibit showcased Edward Andrassi's belongings, a simple pocket watch, a
Whoa.
worn photograph.
Oh, wow.
It's a poignant reminder of the human cost of these crimes.
Yeah, it's easy to get lost in the mystery and forget that. So tell us about some of the victims. Were there any that stood out?
So there are 2 that I find particularly intriguing.
Okay.
One is the tattooed man, John Doe II.
Okay.
He was found dismembered near railroad tracks and had 6 distinctive tattoos.
Wow.
These could be crucial to his identification. Imagine what stories those tattoos could tell about his life.
Yeah.
The other is Jane Doe.
Right?
Her remains were discovered washed ashore, but in separate locations.
Wow.
The sources mentioned varying buoyancy of body parts, which might explain why they were found apart, but it's a chilling thought nonetheless.
Oh, for sure. Wow, those tattoos are like a code, just waiting to be cracked.
Right.
I can see why you'd find that fascinating. The exhibit must really bring that to life.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about the victims and the suspects. But what about other possible connections?
Yeah,
I know there are a lot of theories out there.
there are.
One theory suggests that the Lady of the Lake, a victim found in 1934, could be an earlier victim of the torso murderer.
Hmm.
Another points to Robert Robertson, found in 1950, also decapitated.
Yeah,
Could he be a later victim? I mean, the timelines are off, but it's not impossible.
right.
So, are we thinking this was the work of a single killer? Or could there have been copycats, or even like a group involved?
That's one of the biggest questions surrounding the case.
All right.
And the theories don't stop at the city limits.
What, you mean there are connections to murders outside of Cleveland?
Potentially.
Wow.
Take the murder swamp killings in Pennsylvania, for example.
Okay.
The MO is incredibly similar, and the killings occurred near a railroad line that connected to Cleveland.
Right.
Could the killer have been riding the rails, taking his gruesome hobby on the road?
Oh my gosh, this is getting more and more complex.
Right.
Anything else?
Well, the Black Dahlia case in California also draws comparisons. Similar body disposal techniques and the alleged use of a butcher knife have fueled speculation about a possible link.
Right.
There was even an alleged letter from the torso murderer claiming he'd moved to California and killed somebody there.
Hold on. Are we saying the Cleveland torso murderer might be the Black Dahlia killer? Now that's a twist.
It's a theory.
But wasn't the Black Dahlia case years later?
It was.
And she wasn't decapitated, right?
You're right to be skeptical. The timing is definitely off, and the lack of decapitation is a significant difference.
Yeah.
Still, the alleged letter and the similarities in MO are intriguing.
For sure.
It highlights how these unsolved cases, even across states, can intertwine and capture our imaginations.
I've got to say I'm completely hooked. So much for this being a simple deep dive. What else is there? I feel like we're just scratching the surface.
We are just getting started. What's fascinating to me is that the torso murders weren't just about the victims and the killer. They had a profound impact on the city of Cleveland itself.
That makes it, I mean, this wasn't just a couple of isolated incidents. It was like a reign of terror that lasted for years.
Exactly. Imagine living in Cleveland at that time, knowing that a killer was out there targeting people in such a brutal way.
Right?
The city was gripped by fear and uncertainty.
Yeah.
It really tested the authorities, stretched their resources thin, and exposed the vulnerabilities of a society already grappling with poverty and social unrest.
So it was like the murders became a symbol of a city in crisis.
Yes. In a way, the Great Depression had hit Cleveland hard, and Kingsbury Run was a stark reminder of the desperation and disillusionment that many people were facing. This forgotten part of the city became a haven for those on the margins of society.
Right.
And tragically, that made them easy targets.
That's awful. The exhibit must have some powerful images and stories that illustrate this. It's one thing to read about it, but to actually see the faces of those affected.
It's truly impactful. The curators have done an excellent job of capturing the social context of the time. They've included photographs, newspaper articles, even personal accounts from people who lived in Kingsbury Run.
Yeah.
You really get a sense of the fear and desperation that permeated the community.
Yeah, that's heavy stuff. And to think that Eliot Ness, the guy who took down Al Capone, was the safety director of Cleveland at the time?
Right.
He must have been under immense pressure to solve these murders.
The torso murders became Ness's obsession. He was relentless in his pursuit of the killer.
Yeah.
He led raids on the shantytowns, even burning them down in a desperate attempt to flesh out the killer, or at least protect potential victims.
Wait, he burned down the shantytowns? That seems pretty extreme.
It was a controversial move, for sure.
Yeah.
Some people saw it as necessary, while others criticized it as cruel and ineffective.
Right.
But you have to remember the context. Ness was dealing with a serial killer who seemed to be haunting him. Leaving bodies where he knew they'd be found, it was a desperate situation.
Speaking of those taunts, you mentioned the postcards Ness received. Do we know what they said? Were they directly linked to the murders?
That's another layer of mystery.
Oh, wow.
The exact content of those postcards is lost to history. The museum exhibit alludes to them being threatening in nature, but the specifics are unclear. Were they taunts, confessions, misdirection? We may never know.
Ugh, that's so frustrating.
Yeah.
It's like the killer wanted to stay one step ahead, even in death, by not revealing everything.
Right.
But the fact that they stopped after Sweeney died, it really makes you wonder.
It does, but it's important to remember that these are just pieces of a very complex puzzle.
Yeah.
And we may never have all the pieces.
True, but the mystery is definitely part of the allure, isn't it? It keeps us coming back, trying to piece together the clues to make sense of the senseless.
Absolutely. And the torso murders are particularly captivating puzzle because they touch on so many different aspects of human experience: poverty, desperation, violence, the struggle for justice. It's a story that resonates on multiple levels.
Yeah, it also raises questions about the limits of criminal investigation, especially back then. I mean, imagine if they had the forensic technology we have today, DNA testing, advanced fingerprinting, facial recognition software.
It makes you wonder if the case would have been solved
Right.
back then if they had those tools. Could they have identified the killer, linked him to other crimes, or even exonerated some of the suspects? We can only speculate.
I guess that's part of what makes these cold cases so fascinating.
Right.
We can apply our modern understanding and technology to these historical mysteries and try to imagine how things might have played out differently.
Precisely. But we also have to be careful not to romanticize the past. Forensic science has come a long way.
Yeah.
And while it's tempting to think that today's technology would have solved the case easily, we have to acknowledge the limitations of both past and present methods.
That's a good point. It's not as simple as just plugging in some DNA and getting an instant answer. These cases are complex, and there are always going to be factors we can't control or predict.
And the human element is always a wild card, right? Witnesses can be unreliable, evidence can be misinterpreted, and even the most brilliant investigators can make mistakes.
So even with all our advancements, there's still room for error, for mystery, and that's what keeps us coming back for more. Right?
Exactly. We're drawn to the unknown, to the challenge of trying to solve the unsolvable. And the Torso murders, with their gruesome details, enigmatic killer, and enduring mystery, are a prime example of that.
Speaking of those gruesome details, I can't get over that chemical treatment the killer used on some of the bodies. What do you make of that? Was it just about making identification harder, or was there something more sinister at play?
It's one of the most chilling and perplexing aspects of the case. Some experts believe the killer may have had medical knowledge,
Right.
suggesting a deliberate attempt to hinder identification.
But why go to such lengths? I mean, decapitation and dismemberment are already pretty effective at obscuring identity, aren't they?
You'd think so, but this chemical treatment adds a layer of calculation, of almost scientific detachment that's deeply unsettling. It makes you wonder if there was a psychological component to it, a need to exert control over the bodies, to further dehumanize the victims.
It's like he saw himself as a puppet master,
Yeah.
not just a killer, playing with the police, the public, even Eliot Ness himself.
It's a chilling thought, and it's a reminder that we're not just dealing with a brutal killer,
Right.
but a mind that was capable of incredible cruelty and manipulation.
This is all getting a bit dark. Even for me, maybe we should move on to something a little less dismemberment-y.
I understand it's important to acknowledge the weight of this case, the human cost,
Right.
and not get lost in the sensationalism of it all.
All right, so let's switch gears a bit. We've talked about the victims, the killer's MO, and some of the possible connections to other cases. But what about the broader implications of this case? What can we learn from the Torso murders even all these years later? Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground, the victims, the suspects, the MO, the social context, but now I want to get into the why of it all. Like, what can we even learn from a case like this, even though it happened almost a century ago?
Yeah, I think one of the most important lessons is the enduring vulnerability of those living on the margins of society.
Okay.
You know, many of the Torso murders victims were, drifters, people who had fallen through the cracks of the system.
Right.
They were forgotten, ignored, and ultimately preyed upon.
So you're saying that their social isolation made them, like, easy targets.
Exactly. And it really highlights the need for stronger social safety nets,
Yeah.
for communities that look out for one another, and for resources that provide support to those who are struggling.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if some of these tragedies could have been prevented, if those victims had had a place to turn, somebody to help them.
It's a sobering thought. We often focus on the brutality of the crimes, but it's important to remember the systemic factors that contribute to vulnerability.
Yeah, the exhibit at the Cleveland Police Museum must really drive that point home.
It does. There's a section dedicated to the social conditions in Kingsbury Run during the 1930s. It's a stark reminder of the human cost of poverty and neglect.
So it's not just about catching the killer, it's about addressing, like, the root causes that create an environment where such horrors can even occur.
Precisely. We can't ignore the social context.
Okay, I want to shift gears a bit and talk about the psychology of the killer. Like, what drives someone to commit such gruesome acts? Is it mental illness, a thirst for power, pure evil?
Well, it's rarely a simple answer.
Right.
There's no single profile that fits all serial killers. I mean, some
Yeah.
might exhibit traits of psychopathy, a lack of
Mhm.
empathy and remorse. Others may be driven by a need for control, a desire to dominate and manipulate.
But in this case, you have the added element of the taunting. Like the way the killer seemed to be playing games with Eliot Ness, that suggests a certain level of arrogance, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's almost as if the killer saw himself as an intellectual superior, someone who could outsmart the authorities.
And the brutality of the crimes themselves, the decapitation, the dismemberment, it's like he was trying to dehumanize the victims,
Yeah.
to reduce them to mere objects.
That's a common interpretation, It's a way for the killer to assert power, to distance himself from the emotional weight of his actions.
It's all pretty disturbing. And the fact that the killer was never caught just adds to the mystery and the fear. It's like a ghost story that continues to haunt the city.
I think you've hit on something important there. The unsolved nature of these cases leaves a void, a space for speculation and fear to kind of fester.
Right.
We crave closure,
Yeah.
and when we don't get it, our imaginations run wild.
It's like we're trying to fill in the blanks, to create our own narratives, to explain the inexplicable.
And that's why true crime continues to fascinate us. It allows us to confront our own fears, to explore the dark side of human nature, and to grapple with the mysteries that we may never fully understand.
But it's important to remember that these aren't just stories, right? These were real people, real tragedies.
Absolutely. We have to approach these cases with sensitivity and respect, acknowledging the human cost and the enduring pain that these crimes inflict on families and communities.
Well said. As we wrap up our deep dive into the Cleveland torso murders, I'm left with a mix of awe, fascination, and a touch of unease.
It's a case that stays with you, that makes you question everything you thought you knew about human nature.
It certainly has, for me, thanks for joining me on this journey. It's been a truly enlightening, albeit unsettling, experience.
The pleasure was all mine. It's always fascinating to delve into these historical mysteries and try to piece together the fragments of the past.
And for our listeners, if you're ever in Cleveland, be sure to check out the Cleveland Police Museum's exhibit on the torso murderer. It's a chilling but incredibly well-curated look at one of America's most enduring mysteries.
Yeah, it's a reminder that the past is never truly gone,
Right.
that the echoes of these events continue to shape our present.
Well, that's it for this deep dive. We'll be back soon with another case that's sure to pique your curiosity. Until then, thanks for listening and sleep tight, but maybe double-check the locks.